Next speaker, Simon Heston, is Programme Manager, Improvement Service, and Simon's going to be looking at new ways of working set within public service reform. So, Simon.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for staying after lunch to listen to me. I know I certainly wouldn't have stayed after lunch to listen to myself, but I certainly would have stayed to listen to Anne and Jerry. I've been working on what is called New Ways of Working for probably about 7 or 8 years now. And some of the concepts around New Ways of Working have been around for at least 50 years. I think today I'd like to put perhaps my view on what we mean by New Ways of Working, why it makes good business sense, but more importantly, why it makes good strategic sense. And I think particularly where we sit as public services at the moment with huge cost reduction programs and major demands around the corner, and even more demands in the next 2 to 3 years. I'd also like to put it in the context of ICT, and what is the opportunity for ICT to contribute to that reform agenda. So rather than just constantly keeping the lights on, is how can you as ICT heads and practitioners and deliverers actually make chief execs and councillors and other public officials sit up and show that ICT has a real and valued contribution to make to this. I'm also going to promote, I work predominantly with local government, so I will promote local government, although one of the themes around this is that I don't think we can work within sectors. I think a lot of what we do must be between sectors at both a national and a local level, but also with our supplier markets, those people who produce a lot of the nice fancy kits and goods and software that help us deliver our services. So what is New Ways of Working? These concepts are not new. It is about working from anywhere at any time. By anywhere, I don't necessarily just mean Starbucks or at home. I mean people in the field delivering real services, have access to the right information securely that they need to do their job. And this is not just transactional information. It could be simple knowledge, it could be contacts, it could be getting hold of these people immediately when they're in a client's home. Who do they need to speak to? What information do they need? And is it at their fingertips? It is also about doing the right things well. And it's quite difficult to do the right things well. From an individual to an organisational level, it's understanding how we work and how that contributes to our personal goals, our service goals, our organisational goals, but more importantly, the outcomes of the communities that we serve. And getting that sort of golden thread through right down across the whole organisation is a key challenge. It is performance by outcomes. It's not about the amount of time you're in an office staring at a computer. If you're in an office staring at a computer, it doesn't necessarily mean you're actually working or being productive. If you're not in an office, not staring at a computer, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not being productive. It is about better use of assets. And I don't just mean property here. I mean IT, but I also mean people. People are not a liability, they are an asset. And how do we empower and encourage at an individual and down at the front line our people to deliver? And it is based on sharing, networking, and collaboration. There are real business reasons for doing it. A lot of these figures I haven't just made up before I walked in here. These come from actual councils who are delivering this, and in many cases have actually delivered it. There was a number of studies done on how we actually work across the organisation. I think about eight councils looked at this on a day-to-day basis, from social workers to lawyers to information workers to project managers, and it concluded about 60% of our time was spent on what you could class as overheads, admin, face-to-face meeting, travel, not value-adding activities. That's not a criticism of people. That's the environment they worked in, made them work in this way. We spend about 5 working weeks commuting to and from work. 5 working weeks. And this goes into some of the territory around where is the best place for us to do our work? Do we always have to commute in and out of an office? Every day, spending lots of money as petrol prices go up, spending our time and getting stressed in doing so. The cost of business mileage, this is just local authorities and this is just private cars per annum, is £50 million. So we spend £50 million worth of our time driving around claiming in our own cars. We spend about £1.1 billion of revenue on our property, but we actually only use half of it. The utilisation rates, this may have gone up slightly, hopefully has gone up in the last 2 years, that actually only half of our working space, our desks, are used across local authorities, that is. I'm sure in other sectors it may be better. At least 80,000 staff within local authority could make some change to the way they work. And so 30% of us. There are obviously some areas, such as catering staff, where you can't expect them to work radically differently. But there are almost 80,000 that could make some sort of change to the way they work. Some of the results, one particular council has reduced its property estate by 65%. Now, I should caution that. There is an argument to say they had too much property in the first place, and actually new ways they could have reduced it anyway without changing the way people work. But a large portion of that was down to different ways of working. 17% reduction in business mileage in one council, and between 7% and 40% in productivity. Now this is a key area, and a difficult area to measure. The 7% tends to be people like me who are information workers, and quite difficult to track exactly what I do with my time and how I spend it and how you measure my time. The 40% is a real figure from a transactional service. And this was staff based full-time at home transacting, increased their productivity in the first 6 months by 40%. I will stress this is not all about working at home all the time, but it's one example of a service area that actually achieved that and measured it and could measure it. It is also about staff satisfaction. It is about giving people the choice is when and where and how they work and how it fits with their home life. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, as long as they have clear outcomes and achieving those targets. It is about resilience. It's about putting in automatic resilience, that if there's a heavy snowfall, you can work from anywhere. Recruitment, don't underestimate the expectations of a younger generation coming into a workforce. They expect to work this way. And retention is a key, particularly upon some part-time staff, is how do we retain them and give them the right environment. More importantly, it is about the strategic environment. We have our 4 pillars within the reform agenda which run across all public sector, prevention being at the top of that. I think it's estimated that 40% of our demand is created by ourselves, i.e. failure demand. And one of the key ways or key strategies for combating that is greater integration of services at a very local level. So that's integration not between local authorities, NHS, voluntary sector, private sector, Scottish Government. If we are to really truly do that, and I'm thinking about community partnerships, health and social care integration, you need to have an agile organisation as a very basic. So without major structural reform that takes 2 to 5 years and 10 to 15 million pounds, the ability to get up and go and work with another organisation without any barriers very easily. And on both sides, there was the culture and the ability to do that. You also need people and empowering people, and people with the ability to have the trust and the information at hand to actually deliver these services. And below that, this is actually about performance. It is not about having lions, it's not about having duvet days, it's not about just going to Starbucks because it's your favourite coffee. It is absolutely about setting proper performance targets that relate to something, and that something must be outcomes. So where can IT fit in this? I don't profess to be an IT expert, and some people in the room here that know me will tell you that. I'm not going to go through all of these because I don't understand them all in my entirety myself. What I do understand is that some of the trends that are quite well established or around the corner have a real role to play in the reform agenda. New delivery mechanisms, and I'm not talking just about cloud here, I'm talking about some of the really good programs nationally like SWAN. I'm talking about some of the really innovative within organisations like virtualisation, have a real role to play in how we share and work with each other and deliver outcomes to our communities. Mobility is a given, it's obvious. Both our customers and our staff are becoming mobile. And I'm not just talking about throwing councillors or chief execs iPads. It's about who actually needs the mobility. Is it a chief exec, or is it a councillor, or is it a social worker? Who's the most important person to have that mobility, and who's going to make the biggest difference to the customer? I read a really interesting thing, that there's actually more things attached to the internet than people. And the opportunities around that, around healthcare, around our built environment, are enormous. And I know there's a number of fascinating projects around that, but this needs to be sat within that context of the reform agenda. Data is a fascinating, and I get confused with data where it's open, shared, big, small, closed, whatever, but data is fundamental to a lot of this. Not just in the performance, but understanding where we put our resources. Where's the best place to put our resources? And there is some interesting work going around at community profiling. I know some people in this room do that, but it's really interesting stuff is how can we use big data to provide where is the best place and who is best placed to deliver those services? How can we use business intelligence to give the frontline staff the information, the data they need to go to work to deliver their services? Design is a fascinating, how we design our services now. And I hear an awful lot about co-production, user interfaces, but it does have a place. And I think it's interesting for me how many people involved in IT now, suddenly from a marketing background or a communications background. And I think that's a healthy thing, because it's not just about IT professionals designing, it's about users and different professions saying what works best for the end user. Particularly when we're talking about some fairly vulnerable people. How is it best? How are we going to help them through our design from end to end of our services to use them? Social, I suppose I'm talking about a sort of business Facebook here. I'm not at all advocating that we should be using Facebook in the business. What I'm saying here is around giving people the ability to work across organisations in collaboration and information, and that allows them to work together without having to go through huge hierarchical steps and boards that take 8 months to allow people to actually get on with the job. Can we not give them something instant that they can connect across public sector and find out the right people they need to be talking to? Who's doing this? Well, these are, and apologies, this is local authority biased, and these are largely the councils that I've worked with. There will be other councils out there that are doing this, and no doubt they will tell me after this that they're doing fabulous things, and I'm sure they are. These are the ones that I've predominantly worked with. And some of the leaders in this, like the Aberdeenshires, the Argyll and Bute, and the Renfrewshires, have been at this for about 4 or 5 years. And this is a long process. They have been hugely successful, not necessarily, and I'm sure if the IT people are in here, in fully deploying all the IT, but in getting the leadership buy-in, the cultural change, the policies in place. There are other councils like Fife that are beginning to look at mobility truly in an enterprise fashion. There are other councils like West Lothian who have actually stopped their programme. It is now business as usual. It is no longer a separate programme. It is what they do and how they work. I mentioned the Scottish Borders largely because they're doing some fascinating stuff around unified comms, which many other councils are. But it can be simple applications like that can make a huge difference to how we work. For me, the interesting conversation with the councils using unified comms is how do we federate that? How do we stop it being from within that council to its partners and beyond that? East Renfrewshire I've put up there because they've just started a process, but they're looking at implementing this into their community health partnerships. So this is a joint operation between NHS and the council. Across different systems and different cultures is how do we create a mobile, flexible solution across those two very different cultures. Edinburgh has also been at this, and I mention Edinburgh largely because they do have a very successful home working pilot. Well, it's not a pilot anymore, it's actually in progress, which is people full-time at home processing. Some of the lessons, the risk is not the change. As I said, the change has actually been around for at least 50 years. I think the risk is ourselves, is how we apply this into our organisations. We are fairly traditional, we are fairly hierarchical, we are fairly risk-averse, and a lot of these councils, their experience has taken a long time to get some of the concepts in. There is an argument between the Rolls-Royce and the Fiesta, A lot of the authorities I spoke to who implemented this 3 or 4 years actually overestimated the cost of doing this from a technological point of view. There were some actually easier opportunities to deliver this, and some of the simple things like a BlackBerry for a social worker makes a massive difference to rather a huge intricate line of business implementation. It is not all about technology, but I have a huge sympathy for those in IT departments that are faced with dealing with this huge demand that comes out of new ways of working. It is not all about property, certainly not about hot desking. Hot desking works to a certain extent. It is about using our assets better and how do we shape those assets. Quite a good example is between Fife and Edinburgh. Ourselves working with Scottish Futures Trust is creating an environment where anybody in the public sector can walk into their offices and work. It doesn't matter if you're from Fife, you can use an Edinburgh property. There's an idea of, rather than building new buildings or different concepts, is using each other's assets. There is no one way to do this. A number of councils have done it in a different way, and it is very much about personal choice, and it is about performance. I think my final thought is it makes business sense, but there is a bigger strategic and a reform agenda role for this. I think there's a huge opportunity for IT in this. There are huge challenges in creating that headroom and that resource and that capability and skills to take this forward. I would be biased, but my view is one of those avenues is around better collaboration and, dare I say it, shared services. Not necessarily in solutions, but at the very least in the skills and capabilities that are in this room, both in public and the private sector. And finally, against a lot of odds, not all odds, there are success stories out there. And I firmly believe that certainly within Scotland, we have a public sector that is embracing this. And I would go so far as to say, in many cases, is providing best practice across the UK. Thank you.